in with the time that we have left. We're going to shift gears and go into woody ornamentals, and we have quite a few questions on those. Justin, are you ready to jump us off? I
I
saw
will be glad to. Yeah,
I saw an interesting one that was talking about like rattiness and like some conifer type kind of shrubs. That might be a
absolutely.
good place to start.
Can you guys enable screen sharing? I wanted to share a picture real quick to go along with this question. One of the questions was related to gold mop. I think it's gold mop cypress, Chamaecyparis piscifera. One of my favorite plants. Can't speak enough good things about this. They survived the freeze perfectly. Can you guys see a picture of that plant there? So this is the mature. This was up at the Fall Garden Festival in Crossville. Greg, I don't know what you guys are doing to your plants up there, but my God, they are healthy. I mean,
Oh,
look at
that's
this thing.
beautiful.
Now I'm not a tall man. I get this. This is eye level. I'm 5'6" on a good day, but I'm standing there taking a picture of this plant, and this plant was every bit of 6 or 7 foot tall. And I want to show this picture to stress that this is the mature size of this plant. People will plant these in their landscape. They'll get them and they're 3 foot tall and 3 foot wide. And I don't think people realize how big these plants get. So with that being said, if you have a plant in this condition, and I believe that this is the most beautiful specimen I've ever seen, and I would never touch it. But if this is against your house, what are your options? Well, they're limited. And the reason why we treat coniferous type evergreens different than, let's say, a broadleaf evergreen like a boxwood or a holly is because the buds on this plant, they're very near the outer edges of this plant. So the canopy is not very dense. So if you were to go in and make major pruning cuts, the odds of those areas where you've made cuts into old wood rejuvenating are slim or no chance whatsoever. And you're going to have big gaps then. So if you were to try to go in and prune out and lower the height effectively, you're basically just going to top this plant and you're going to have massive exposed areas with very little regrowth. Now you can do minor pruning if there's a branch here or a branch there, and you can selectively reach in. But bear in mind though that those areas, they will not fill back out in the same way that a holly would. And I think the question was, can they cut them back to the ground and will they come back? And the answer there is absolutely not. There's no chance. If you were to basically, we call it rejuvenation pruning. If you were to take this down to the ground, you might as well go ahead and run a stump grinder because you're not getting this plant to come back. So, it's unfortunate because I love these plants, and unfortunately, they are planted a lot of times too close together, or they're crammed into a landscape where they shouldn't have been planted. But pruning on these is few and far between. So I think the last statement in my answer to this question was, if it's to the point where you're not able to go in and do any minor pruning, removal may be the only option. So, anyways, awesome plant. Unfortunately, they get planted in the wrong place way more often than not.
So true. I mean, they are so cute in their little pots, and it's hard to resist the urge to just want to plant several of them in a little row, right by your walkway. But
I'm guilty
it's
of it
happened.
myself. I have two of them in front of my house, and I pack them in with limelight hydrangeas. And limelights are aggressively growing too. So I'm going to have some serious decisions to make this fall. Something's got
A,
to go.
a jungle. You're gonna have a
Absolutely.
What's holding back my limelights right now is the autumn clematis. We're talking about a pretty good balance there.
I've got that too.
Okay, good question. Okay, what about I'm looking on our question sheet here. Lee, we had a question that came in that's asking about shrubs, and in parentheses they put laurels, some different types of viburnums, things like that. They say they're coming back nicely after the freeze that we had. Their growth is strong at the moment. What do you suggest that we do as far as pruning or thinning them? When should that be done? Any kind of just like general grooming, right? Because we
Yeah.
didn't do heavy pruning because we were just trying to wait for everything to see how things are going to come back out. But now we've got these plants that survived, and some of them look wild. So what are our best options?
That's right, Celeste. So great question. Hey, everyone. Welcome. I'm Lee Rumble. I'm a commercial horticulture agent over in Knox County. I think I always forget to introduce myself, Celeste. So there's finally one time that I did. So
I do too. By the way, y'all, I'm Celeste. I've been talking a lot.
Yeah. Well, first and foremost, congratulations to the laurels for coming back. You all remember that Arctic frost that we had. We thought everything was going to die, but us as horticulturalists really weren't that concerned about many of their species. We saw a few things die, like Chamaecyparis and Indian hawthorn, but those are about the only two species that I saw flat out die. I know, depending on where you're at, we saw some hollies die and some other species depending on their site. But the fact that you have new growth is quite encouraging, and we realize that because it has a well-established root system. So when we think about a very stressful event, and just previously we were talking about this, how trees are starting to flower right now. I've seen ornamentals flowering as well. I've seen them in the middle of December flower. If we think about a year of stress, this is certainly that year. We haven't had rains here in Knoxville very much. We had the Arctic blast, we had a late frost. So I often liken, regrowth much to how we would treat ourselves after we get sick. After we get sick, we don't want to go out and exert a ton of energy. So I would kind of encourage you here on this note to go ahead and let this plant rebound fully so that it doesn't have to divert resources away from growth and repair and put those into trying to compartmentalize or trying to fix areas that we have removed from the plant. So I would really encourage you to leave every piece of foliage on this plant that you can so it can store all the sugars that it needs. Again, sugars are stored in these twigs and the crown, the roots of the plant. So if we go in and remove a lot of live foliage, we're taking away photosynthates that would ultimately be stored. The next thing, Celeste, is we don't want to prune this late. Our fall equinox is right around the corner. I think it's the 22nd, 23rd. So we don't want to initiate any new growth at this point. So what I would encourage you to do, especially for the laurels, I'd like to see you prune those, and I mean structure prune those in late January, February, maybe as early as March. And I want you to look out for cross limbs, limbs that rub against one another, areas that might be crowded, or any areas of those plants that just have errant growth. Now, viburnums would be a little different since they're an early spring flowering tree. We might want to wait until after they flower so we don't reduce that floral bloom. But yeah, the nice thing about a regrowth like this, or what we had was a impromptu regenerative prune, if you will, by the environment. This allows us to shape that plant back to what we want it to be. So if you can maintain it over the next few months, you'll be able to maintain it at a size and a height you like. So yeah, I think that's about it, Celeste. I would say try and keep all the foliage you can this year. And then this next early winter, late winter, early spring, consider pruning.
Yay. Good answer. And that actually kind of goes along. We had another question come in that was asking more specifically about pruning back for azaleas, rhododendrons, and boxwoods. So, I mean, all the things that we've just talked about. Obviously, now is not a good time to prune azaleas and rhododendrons as they are spring bloomers. If we did heavy pruning on them now, they specifically said they are quite large and old. So if the objective is size reduction, now is not the time. You would lose your bloom for next year, and also this just is not the ideal time to do that heavy type of rejuvenation pruning. You want to reserve that for, like Lee said, late winter. Okay. As far as boxwoods go, if you're keeping those like in a hedge type form, they're likely sheared several times throughout the growing season, but we really don't want to see any more shearing. I really wouldn't have liked to see any more shearing from like maybe the middle of August onward. So resist the urge to go out there and clip off maybe a few of the little wild ones that have sprung up, because you'll just be setting yourself up for a new flush of growth. And then that, even if it's just 1 inches, right, that grows between now and when those plants start really slowing themselves down, that 1 inch of growth is going to be more susceptible in the spring when the plant wakes back up, it starts growing, then we get a frost, and then that's going to be the first thing that's damaged, and you'll just have to shear it off again, right? So those are all great tips on pruning. Always like to make sure folks are going in the right direction with that. This also kind of goes along with pruning. There was a question that came in. It says, this is our Yoshino cherry tree planted 2 years ago. It doesn't have a central leader branch. How would you recommend pruning, and which branch would you select as the leader? And I think this is a good conversation to have, because sometimes that can be done and sometimes it can't.
And sometimes it can't. That's right. So this was a great question, actually. And, it really excites me as an arborist to hear people saying, my tree doesn't have a central leader. What should I do? And I realize that's a little bit left field, but that as an arborist, that's really what I want to see, in many cases, are trees that have a nice central leader and well-developed scaffold branches off of that. Now, I'm not going to get too nerdy here, but we have X-current growth type trees and we have D-current growth type trees. Our X-current growth trees are those that have that really nice established central leader. So think about a bald cypress, a tulip poplar, black gum, sweet gum. These have strong X-current tendencies, meaning they want a central lead. But D-currents, our oaks, our maples, our lindens, they're more of that globe shape. Think about the, I hate to say this word, but Bradford pear, that's what we call a D-current, where they have multiple scaffold branches that really don't originate as a central lead. Now, cherry, I would argue, could be kind of in the mix or the middle of those two. Certainly with a Yoshino, if we get to the, to the nursery and we see one that has a nice central leader, we can train it and we can retain that central leader for many years. But if you've ever seen, a 30-year-old specimen Yoshino, which is pretty rare, 25, 30 years is pushing it for a Yoshino. Oftentimes they do flatten out in the top and they will get a whole lot wider than they actually are tall. So on this tree, I would argue, this is probably one that you're never going to get back to that X-current shape. You're never going to get a central lead out of this. And instead, what I kind of transitioned this answer into was, I want you to look for included bark. In other words, we know this is codominance. This is where, limbs of the same size originate from one central location on a tree. That is codominance. But the bigger problem with codominance is when these codominant stems develop included bark. So, look at how close those stems are growing. We know that those trees that have real narrow V-shaped branch unions are more vulnerable to splitting. But in your case, these aren't really areas that I see major issues with. Now, I could argue that front stem there could have an area. Yeah, where's the one to the right there, Celeste? Yeah, that one there. So that one could become an issue because I do see right where Celeste is pointing there where there could be some crowding. But again, when we go in and take a cut that large, we're probably going to disfigure that tree. But sometimes that minor disfiguring is better than the long-term allowing, of the codominant stems to eventually split apart. So remember, in nature, I'm so happy you're talking about a single central leader, but trees get inadvertently topped all the time. Think about squirrels that build nests at the tops of trees. We see trees have storm damage where the top gets broken out and they still survive. So don't panic on this one. Just look for those crowded areas and crossing branches and enjoy your tree from there.
Excellent. So this is kind of funny, but we have another question that has to do with ornamental cherry trees. So, and believe it or not, none of the questions are mentioning holes in their leaves, which is the number one question I always get associated with this plant at this time of year. Their leaves have holes, the leaves are turning yellow, all the leaves fell off, right? So that's shot hole, by the way. We're just throwing that one in for an extra. But so this question says, we have a cherry blossom tree. Something has been eating the leaves. About a month ago, the leaves were gone within a few days. The tree has since grown more and it has grown taller, but the leaves are being eaten again. Could you help us know what's going on? And so let me pull this picture up. I think Bob, you kind of led the lead for the answer on that one. And so I will just say, while I was reading the question before I pulled the picture up, when they said something's eating the leaves, in my head I was like, oh yeah, they've got shot hole. They just think those holes are from insects. But lo and behold, when I pulled the picture up, I was proven wrong. So this is what they're seeing right here. You see how those leaves are certainly being chewed right down to that mid vein right there. So any tips on what might be happening here, Bob?
Well, as I looked at that, I kind of felt like the same way you did, Celeste, when I read the question. But then looking at the photograph, there's some real defoliation that's going on right down to the midrib, and definitely a chewer of some sort. And if my thoughts are that if they observed this earlier too, there are just a whole host of insect pests that are going to attack trees and shrubs and other plants through the course of the growing season. So we might not have the same thing happening now that would have happened earlier in the season. And so it demonstrates how important it is to first identify the pest and to be scouting and to try to catch it early, and then to be able to treat as necessary, then to try to control that pest. But I just felt like that was really important, and to think about. And we might say too that it seems, sometimes fruit trees are more susceptible to attack because of the type of growth that they have, that they just seem to be more susceptible. And so we're going to many times see that damage on our fruit trees, our ornamentals that are in the fruit families, and that we're not going to find on other trees in the landscape. So
Good
there's
point.
identify the pest, think about what might be out there during this time of year, and just treat as necessary. But if otherwise, certainly at this time of the growing season, as we're approaching the end of the growing season, treatment may not be necessary. Probably I wouldn't treat myself, but if the tree's otherwise healthy, Lee, you get me here. If the tree's otherwise healthy, this is just cosmetic and it's no long-term negative impact on the tree.
That's right, Bob. I'm so glad you said that. Yeah, we care much more about an early season defoliation than we do a late season defoliation event. Because early season, they've exerted a lot of energy to put that foliage on. So if they immediately lose it, we have more fears. That's when I might control insects or caterpillars early in the year. Late in the season, let them eat all they want. Go out and look at your tree. I would argue there's probably buds already being set on this tree. And if that's the case, you have very little to worry about. We see that with fall webworm a lot of times. I'm not going to manage that more than likely, unless it's a brand new tree, that has a excessive amount of fall webworm. But yeah, I think Bob hit it right on the head there. Just focus on growing, not killing, like Greg said.
I think that leads right into, we have another question on here. Actually, I'm going to tell you all the backstory. This was a site visit call that I had, and it just happened like 2 days ago. And while I was out there, I said, man, this would be a perfect question for us to talk about, because it might be going on other places, right? And when I first got the call, she said, it's this oak tree. It's about, 7 years old. The leaves are like dying, and it's kind of started at the top, and it's, doing weird things. I think it's dying. Can you come out and look at it? And so in my head, usually when I get a call about, it was a red oak, right? So I was like, it's probably, she didn't know what kind. I was like, it's probably a pin oak. Leaves are dying. It's late season. I bet it has bacterial leaf scorch, right? It's in a residential type setting. So that's what I'm going in thinking, that's probably what we're going to see. But then I get there, and that was not what we saw. So let me show you this picture. From far away, it looked like the entire top half of the tree had just turned translucent. They weren't brown and crispy. They weren't even yellow. They just looked translucent. And when I got up close and looked straight up through the canopy, this is what I saw. And so this type of feeding damage is called window painting. Okay. So that tells us that the insect that was doing this feeding, their mouth parts weren't large enough to bite all the way through the leaf. All they could do was scrape, the under epidermis layer off, and it leaves you with this translucent looking leaf. And you can see the higher you go up, the worse that feeding damage is. And so then let me show you what was actually causing the problem. Can y'all see that picture now? I changed it. So this is oak sawfly larva right here. And this was also a weird thing. As we were walking up, there were all these, I wasn't really looking at it because there were like gnats all over. And I was like, my goodness, what is happening out here? And then as soon as I started looking at the tree, we're putting together the feeding damage signs. Then I see this larva. Then I really took a closer look at those gnats slash black flies. They were the adults of these oak sawflies. Okay. So just being observant, putting all the pieces together. And she said that this happened to this tree last year as well. And the the feeding is pretty extensive, but the tree leafed out normally this year. The canopy was nice and full. Like they mentioned before, we're late in the season. All these leaves are fixing to fall off when that first frost comes anyway. So I don't think that control is a must, but since she knows it's an issue, I told her that she needs to be vigilant for next year, and of course gave some recommendations for some systemic control, because they are rather young trees, and when you have several years of severe feeding on young trees, that can impact the overall health of them. So she's going to keep an eye out for that for next year. But I asked her if I could use these pictures, and she's like, oh, yes. And I told her all about office hours. So if you're on here today, Lisa, thank you.
And oftentimes, you know, predators, birds, parasites, and even pathogens can take care of many of those caterpillars as well. And, you know, so